I've heard that premillennialism was mostly the view of Jewish Christians of the early church, but that later the Gentile church sought to separate themselves from Jewish thought, and this greatly influenced amillennialism. I'm not sure that's an accurate description. Historians can only know so much, after all, and sometimes we make mistakes in reasoning. There were many non-Jewish Christians that wrote of a premillennial view, Justin Martyr for one. I'm pretty sure that Irenaeus or Hippolytus or Polycarp weren't Jewish, or Tertullian. One simple fact is, the majority of works we have by the earliest Christians are Gentile, and they are mostly premillennial. But it's also probably true that one could successfully argue that Christians also sought to separate themselves from Jewish thought later on. However, the Bible plainly teaches that we are grafted into Israel and have become a part of the commonwealth of Israel. It states in Ephesians 2:12 that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. Then verse 19 states, "Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God." Maybe Christians separating themselves from Jewish thought wasn't that good of a move. It's a good idea for foreigners to learn American thought and cultures if they become citizens of America, after all. It's no different if we, as foreigners, have now become citizens of Israel, whether that nation of Israel is a spiritual nation or a literal one. It wasn't Jewish thought Christians needed to separate themselves from, but the idolatry and misapplication of the law by the Pharisees and other leaders. They condemned through the law, rather than recognize that the purpose of the law was to show us how imperfect we are. That because we are imperfect, we should have mercy on one another. It wasn't Jewish thought that Christians needed to separate themselves from, but the false Judaism that didn't recognize Jesus as the Messiah. The problem wasn't Jewish thought as much as it was that the religious leaders had perverted or misunderstood the interpretation of the law since the time it was established. And this is the one reason the prophets of the Old Testament were so critical of Israel, but also promised a Messiah that would restore the true meaning of the law. For example, it was spoken of Jesus through Isaiah the prophet in chapter 42, verse 21, that the Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honorable. Also, I think it's important to note that the idea of a 1,000-year reign is only mentioned in the book of Revelation. So it seems unlikely that Jews or Christians held such a notion prior to Revelation, other than maybe a weird interpretation of 2 Peter 3:8. Since many Jews believe the age of the earth to be 6,000 years old, they suggest that premillennialism is itself too Jewish. In short, they'll say the Jews or Jewish-influenced Christians also thought the age of the earth was 6,000 years old, so we can't rely too much on those views. In keeping with Christian thought, it seems that the idea comes from the tradition of the elders. I mean, there's nowhere in the Bible that says such a thing. I guess it's possible that prior to Revelation, some Jews and Christians may have held a proto-view of the millennial reign due to their view of the earth being 6,000 years old and an interpretation of a 1,000-year Sabbath. Neither science nor Christian theology confirm a literal understanding of the creation week, except for in some fundamentalist denominations. But back to the eschatological point. In short, it's conflating two issues and is a classic example of the argument from fallacy. See, they thought the earth was 6,000 years old in their time. That's one point where they were wrong. That's the fallacy. But the other issue is that at some point, the last days will come and Christ will set up his kingdom. The book of Revelation clearly describes a 1,000-year reign with Christ before he judges the unrighteous. So the fallacy is the age of the earth, and the conclusion was that the description in Revelation is literal. Their fallacy in the age of the earth does not make the conclusion incorrect. They had other reasons for believing in a premillennial view, including the strong evidence that the one who penned Revelation, John the Apostle, held a premillennial view, along with the people he taught and what Revelation actually says about the millennium. Some of these issues I will likely raise below, as I'm fairly certain they would have looked at the text similar. Some have made the argument that the millennium is referencing Christ's spiritual kingdom that he is now ruling. I'm not sure that really matters because, to my knowledge, all Christians agree that Christ has already set up his spiritual kingdom. But all Christians also agree that he will one day set up a physical kingdom, or at least rule over a physical kingdom. This is because Christ physically returns. The issue is, when Christ sets up his kingdom, do only those that have accepted him get to be raised, but that the sinners have to wait 1,000 years to be resurrected? Doesn't a symbolic view kind of go against the purpose of Revelation? The book of Revelation is the revelation of Jesus Christ. As a Christian, I take on faith that Christ spoke to John. It's certainly what John stated in his book. However, I find it improbable that Jesus or angels would have told John to write about a 1,000-year reign, particularly if the Jews already had a false belief about a literal 1,000-year reign, if it were untrue. The whole purpose of the book is to reveal Jesus Christ and his coming kingdom. Sure, there are symbols there. No one expects a literal beast to come out of the sea, for example. We know that the Bible is using clear references to empires, or even a personal antichrist in some places. But the point is that the book isn't meant to be veiled in mystery or overly symbolic. It's the unveiling of Christ, not the veiling of Christ. For me, the most major issue with the view of a symbolic millennium is what the Bible actually says about the millennium and the events surrounding it. A symbolic interpretation just raises way too many questions. For starters, we know that the false prophet and the beast are thrown into the fire and that they're somehow separate from Satan. It states in chapter 19 that the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the signs by which he had deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped its image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur, and the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on the horse, and all the birds were gorged with their flesh. This passage is taking place right before the millennium, so we can conclude that the false prophet and beast are somehow separate from Satan, since Revelation records that Satan is thrown in after the millennium. We can obviously conclude that the figures are thrown into the lake of fire after the reign of the beast, along with the false prophet that makes people worship the image of the beast. So, under an amillennial view, these events had to have happened already, since they claim that we are now in the millennium. Remember, The Bible records that the false prophet and beast are thrown into the lake of fire before the millennium. At what point in history has any empire or man been thrown into the lake of fire? The text makes clear that it is Christ who is killing these people, these remnant who had received the mark of the beast. It says, the rest were slain by the sword that came from the mouth of him who was sitting on his horse. The writer is described as a clear reference to Christ just a few verses earlier, starting with calling him faithful and true in verse 11. So, if, as the amillennialists say, we are currently in the millennium, and yet the Bible records these men as being slain by Christ prior to the millennium, one has to ask, at what point has Christ came back and slain people for receiving the mark? Moreover, doesn't the book of Acts record that it is Christ whom heaven must receive until the time for restoring all things about which God spoke by the mouth of the holy prophets long ago? So, if an amillennialist makes a claim that Christ has come back in the past to slay people, wouldn't they be clearly in error of Scripture? Furthermore, it seems to me that those who reject a literal millennium would also have to reject hell as a real place of torture and suffering. Why? Because the amillennialists would have to argue that the false prophet and beast have been thrown into the lake of fire in some symbolic manner in the past. Likewise, they would logically conclude that Satan and the unrighteous, when judged at the end of the millennium, are also thrown into a symbolic lake of fire. To conclude, if the false prophet and beast haven't been thrown into the lake of fire, how could the millennium have possibly started? And if the amillennialist argues that the false prophet and beast have been thrown into a symbolic lake of fire in the past, then who were the false prophet and beast? When were they thrown into the symbolic lake of fire? Who were the men that were slain that worshipped the beast? Has Christ came back and slain people? When did this happen? Are the unrighteous and Satan also thrown into some symbolic lake of fire after this present symbolic millennium? Since the amillennialist would argue that the false prophet and beast were thrown into the lake of fire symbolically in the past. That's why, in my opinion, amillennialism is faulty. It raises too many questions and logically implies that hell isn't a real place of suffering. Thanks for your time. If you found this message inspiring, don't forget to subscribe.